Hi, welcome to a Physionic detailed study analysis. Today we're going to be discussing OMAD, or 1 meal a day, which is a pretty popular form of intermittent fasting, a little bit more extreme version of 16 hours of fasting, so 16-8, which is a popular form as well. So 1 meal a day is exactly as it sounds, just consuming one meal in a day. So that typically illustrates itself as, fasting for 20 hours, 22 hours, 23 hours. But ultimately, the bottom line is you just consume one meal throughout the day. Now, we're going to be covering 4 different studies to find out the effect that OMAD has on a number of different health parameters. So if that's blood pressure, blood sugar tolerance, cholesterol, things of that nature. So if that's what you're here to find out about, then you're in the right place. If you're not familiar with who I am, my name is Nicholas Verhoeven. I'm a PhD candidate in molecular medicine, and I hold my master's in exercise physiology. And this is what I do. I take studies, group them all together, put them all together, and do a transparent study analysis so that you can actually see the data for yourself and either agree or disagree with my interpretations of the data. If you disagree, then certainly feel free to use the form that I have where you can fill it out and send it to me, and then I will try to go over your comments. And if you have some good points, then I'll make an amendment to this video so that other people can benefit from your corrections of my work. And along with that, then you have made science literacy that much better. So thank you. All right. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into this study analysis. We're going to be covering, as I mentioned, I've put together a few different topics. So we're going to be covering how 1 meal a day affects blood pressure, blood sugar, and cholesterol, as well as some hormonal changes, looking at briefly some leptin, ghrelin, and adiponectin, and OMAD on weight loss without intention. And the reason why that's important, is why I added that without intention, is because often OMAD can have this side effect of without counting calories, without counting energy intake, you can still experience weight loss, which is a pretty amazing effect. So we'll see if that actually pans out. And then for my insiders, those of you that are part of the premium network, that are part of the insiders program, also get access to the extended version of this video, which includes all these topics, along with OMAD on inflammatory markers, so like interleukin-6, for example, and OMAD on oxidative stress as well. Okay, but if you're interested in just these topics, let's go ahead and jump into the studies. Now, the studies that we're going to be going over are studies number 18, 144, 145, and 146. So the reason why I've got 18 here is because I was actually supposed to cover this a long time ago. I was trying to cover this study as well as a few other studies a long time ago, specifically on intermittent fasting. So it wasn't specifically OMAD, but it was on intermittent fasting. And it's just now that I'm getting around to this study analysis. So from way back when, I'm pulling on one of those studies and then pulling together the more recent studies that have also come out on OMAD. Now, that said, this is 4 studies. And while we're going to get some information out of this, that doesn't mean that we're not going to be covering future studies. There's going to be more studies that are going to come out on OMAD, and I certainly expect to cover those studies as well. If you're interested, you can look up my notes where I'll have a little bit of additional information on each one of these studies with the amendments that there may be some, as well as the funding sources, which let's get into the funding sources actually. So we're going to start out with study 18, and you can see that it's public funding. Now, if I'm going to start adding the actual who the funding agency is, if it's let's say nonprofit, who is the nonprofit? But in this situation, I can quick tell you it's the National Institute of Aging and the USDA, so a government organization. So taxpayer funding was solely responsible for the funding of this study. Okay. So we always have to look at the study design as well. That's incredibly important. So the researchers recruited 15 men and women, and it's primarily women. So it's 2/3 of the participants were women, and they were average age of 45 years of age, normal weight and healthy. And they were randomized into a 1 meal a day condition or 3 meals a day condition, which means that 1 meal a day, obviously they consumed all their energy intake, all their macronutrients, all their nutrients in general in one meal. And then at the 3 meals a day, they consumed the same macronutrients, same nutrients, etc., over 3 meals. So breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And they were randomized, which means that they had an equal chance of starting out in the 1 meal a day condition or the 3 meals a day condition. And it was double blind, which is a little bit of an odd way of using double blind. Usually you have like a placebo, for example, but it's not like these people are blinded and don't know if they're consuming 1 meal or 3 meals a day or anything like that. It's more so that the researchers don't know which condition that the participants are in when they're taking the blood measurements, for example. And they also just don't inform the participants, this is specifically what we're measuring, or this is what we're interested in, so that the participants don't somehow influence or change their behavior in some way. Now, the length of the study was, 8 weeks on 1 meal a day and then 8 weeks on 3 meals a day. Now, they're not happening congruently, or they're not, the study isn't happening congruently. You have some people that are on the 1 meal a day, and then they switch over to the 3 meals a day. And then the people that start out on the 3 meals a day start out there and then switch over to 1 meal a day. How did that work? Well, it worked this way. So this is a crossover design. So it was 8, let's say you're one of the participants. You would have started out, let's say you were randomly allocated to 1 meal a day. So you started out 1 meal a day. So you were on that eating plan for 8 weeks. So you would consume your 1 meal a day in the evening for 8 weeks. And then you had a washout period of 11 weeks where you return back to your normal diet, no restrictions, just return back to your normal life for 11 weeks. And then, which is this crossover bar here. And then you would start on the 3 meals a day. So it's the exact same diet composition as the 1 meal a day, but it's as 3 meals. So breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So more spread out, clearly. And then obviously, if people were started out here, then they did the exact same thing, but ended up in the 1 meal a day. And the researchers took measurements at baseline and at 8 weeks. Now, when they took measurements, there's a caveat that I have to add in here, because they had to change up how they do things. And I realized that the researchers were doing this for a very good reason. They usually, when you take blood measurements in general, you have to go through a fasting period. So you do it's usually a minimum of 8 hours, but it's typically closer to 10 or 12 hours or longer that you should be fasting for you to get fasting blood values of, let's say, your blood sugar levels, cholesterol levels, all that stuff. And for the 3 meals a day, it's not that big a deal, right? You consume your breakfast, you eat your lunch, you eat your dinner, and then the next day in the morning, let's say 8 a.m., after 10, 12 hours fasting. I think for this, the researchers pointed out that they wanted everyone to have been fasting for 12 hours, which is a good amount of time. So a minimum of 12 hours. So 12 hours later, after they finished their dinner, they went to sleep. They were fasting for those 8 hours that they were asleep. Then they came into the lab and had their blood panel taken, which is very standard, and that's how it happens across almost every other study. However, the difficulty here, is that if you consume 3 meals a day, you're spreading out your nutrients over those 3 meals, right? It's because you're still trying to hit that exact the overall same amount of nutrients, but just spread out over 3 meals. That's fine, but you're only consuming 1/3 of your nutrients, of your total daily nutrients, in that third meal, which would probably be out of your system by 12 hours later. Okay, fine. It would be out of your gastrointestinal system, your stomach, your duodenum. You've absorbed everything, and therefore it's in your bloodstream. Now think about the same amount of nutrients, but it has to be packed into 1 meal at the exact same time. So now you're consuming triple the amount. So per meal, you're consuming triple the amount, because here you are only consuming 1/3 per meal. Here you're consuming all of it in 1 meal. Okay. So now imagine 12 hours later, are all those nutrients going to be taken out of your system and been allocated to your cells and whatnot? Probably not. So a 12-hour fast may not be equivalent for a 1 meal a day compared to a 3 meals a day. So therefore, there's a confounding variable there, which is a pretty hefty one. So what the researchers cleverly did is that they decided to measure these people in the evening before they consumed their first meal. So they went 8 weeks OMAD, and then when they ended up doing the measurements, they ended up not doing it the next day in the morning, but the next day in the evening. So they ended up fasting for like 20 hours, something like that. So you could argue that maybe there's some slight differences between 12 hours fasting on 3 meals a day versus 20 hours fasting on OMAD. That, you could make that argument. I think that the effects are probably pretty negligible. I think the benefits are much higher by doing it this way, because then you're making sure that this OMAD condition is for sure fasted, because they haven't consumed anything for 20, maybe even 22 hours. So it's quite a long time, and for sure they're fasted. Great. The only drawback that I see to this, however, or one of the major ones, is that you're not accounting for circadian rhythms. So if there are changes in blood sugar variation, let's say it's higher, let's say in the morning, and then it's lower in the evening, then you're measuring these people in the evening and you're measuring these people in the morning. And the baseline measures were done in the morning. So comparing a morning baseline measure versus an evening fasted result could skew the results. So the way that I would have done it is that I would have had everybody consume 1 meal a day for 8 weeks, then return to all the participants on 3 meals a day for 1 day, and then measure them 12 hours later at the exact same time in the morning. And that way, most likely, whatever positive or negative effects that are happening with 1 meal a day are probably not going to disappear after a 24-hour period of consuming 3 meals a day again. But it controls for a lot of the other factors that could be confounding factors, like I was just talking about. So that's a pretty big caveat that I have to add to this, because it's extremely important. It could skew the results and how we interpret the results. So hopefully that's clear. If you have questions, please feel free to ask. Okay, that all out of the way, let's get into the baseline data. So this is baseline data. This is before the participants were on either diet. So we're talking about their age, their triglycerides, cholesterol, fat mass, et cetera, et cetera. So just a few of their baseline measures. And all grouped together, all 15 individuals grouped together, they had an average age of 45 years of age, which I reported earlier, with a standard deviation of 0.7. So the standard deviation is the amount of variance from the average. So some people were 46 years old. Some people were maybe 45.5. Some people were 44.3 years old, but they were ultimately all grouped together. They landed around the average 45. And that's true for all of these. Now, everything looks perfectly normal. Blood pressure looks good, all that. However, their LDL cholesterol was maybe a little bit high, on the high side, but not astronomical. Okay, so that's it. So we're just making sure that we keep a snapshot of the baseline values in our head. And then we're going to go into the nutrition. So what did they actually consume? Well, first off, they don't show the calorie consumption here, but they ended up reporting the calorie consumption was roughly equivalent. So they ended up indicating that there was no statistical significance between the two conditions. So if they consume 1 meal a day or 3 meals a day. And that was by design. They specifically designed this experiment or this study so that they were not consuming a difference in calories, and they were trying to maintain their weight. So that was another thing. They were supposed to be a weight maintenance. However, although it was not statistically significantly different between the two, I believe, if I remember correctly, the OMAD group did consume about 100 calories, around 100 calories less. So while the statistics wouldn't have picked that up, because they don't have enough participants to actually tease out the differences between those two, so meaning that the study was underpowered to be able to detect the differences, what that could indicate is over 8 weeks, like sure, day to day, like on one day versus another day, you may not notice a difference, but over 8 weeks, so 2 months of 100 calories less consumption, that could lead to some real effects. And I'll go ahead and tell you that there are some real effects that end up presenting themselves. And that's not really a huge shock, right? Like if you go from consuming and just grazing throughout the entire day, And then suddenly researchers are telling you, okay, now you need to consume this number of calories, these nutrients, and make sure that you consume it all within a 2-hour period or 1-hour period. You're going to start struggling. I mean, you're going to try to consume everything that you're supposed to consume, but you're going to have a tough time. I don't know if you've ever tried that, to consume all your food in one meal, but it can be tough if you're specifically focused on like whole foods, which is what these researchers typically tell people to consume, whole foods. There may be a disparity there that the statistics don't pick up, but statistically speaking, there are no differences in energy intake. Okay, that said, the proportions of which are roughly the same. So protein, 1 meal a day condition versus 3 meals a day, 14.5 versus 14.7. Again, there's no real big differences in protein, fat, or carbohydrate, the overall amounts. Now, if we break up the fats into polyunsaturated fats, monounsaturated fats, and saturated fats, what do we find? We find that polyunsaturated fats here, mono, and then saturated fats. The problem that I see with this is that they're not indicating what these numbers are. So I don't see any units, and they're not ratios as far as I can tell, because a ratio would be to 1, so 1 representing 100%. So it'd be 1.0. However, for a saturated fat, they're already at 1.1, so they blew through that ratio. And if you add these up, it doesn't lead to 1, it doesn't lead to 2, it doesn't lead to any nice even number, it just leads to a number. So I'm not entirely sure how they quantified this. I don't know what this means. I just know that statistically there were no differences in the amount of polyunsaturated, monounsaturated, and saturated fats that they consumed between the two groups, especially with monounsaturated and saturated. You can tell that they were equivalent, 1.1 to 1.1, 0.8 to 0.8. However, polyunsaturated fat was 0.5 to 0.7. Again, what units those are, if that's percentages, if that's grams, I don't know. I don't know any of that. So they didn't do a great job explaining this, but they indicated that the statistics showed that there were no differences. So that's what we've got. In terms of overall cholesterol intake, there were no differences, 140 to 148. Okay, great. Now here they made a mistake. Dietary fiber is not should not be illustrated in milligrams. So milligrams, they've got 7.4 milligrams per 1,000 kilocalories. Really, fiber should be reported as grams per 1,000 kilocalories. That is typically like 14, 15 grams of fiber per 1,000 kilocalories. That's like the general understanding. But here they're reporting as milligrams. So I think what they ported it from the cholesterol and just moved it down and added it to fiber. And so they made a mistake here. You could argue that there may be some differences here. I don't remember them reporting that there are any statistical differences here, but the 3 meals a day may have slightly more. But then again, this is per 1,000 calories. So if let's say you assume that these people are consuming 2,000 calories total for their diet, 2,000 calories, that means that you just double these. So that's around 9. So let's say 18. So I think it's like, what, 17.8 in total. So 17.8 versus, or 18 versus, let's say 7.5. So 7.5 times 2 is 15. So you're only talking about a 3 gram difference. Is that going to make a world of difference? No, it's not. I mean, you could argue that it does, but I feel pretty confident saying that 3 grams of fiber difference between the diets is not going to lead to world just changing, just like the world is completely different in one camp versus another camp. The reason why the other camp has incredibly great cholesterol is because the 3 grams of fiber, I wouldn't buy that at all. So largely there are no differences in fiber. That's my point, and they made a mistake with the milligrams here. Okay, now we're actually getting to the results. This is what the initial results indicate. So how we read this is we look at the p-value here. The p-value indicates, so anything below 0.05, anything below 0.05 means there is a statistical significant difference. Now, we're not just really comparing these two against one another. Typically, what you would want to do is compare them against the baseline as well. So looking at this baseline here. And unfortunately, for some reason, the researchers didn't report the baseline here. It would have been nice if they'd taken the data that we looked at over earlier and actually ported it in here so that we don't have to constantly go back and forth between the two. But here they're indicating, let's say, systolic blood pressure is 116.1 and the 3 meals a day is 109. And there is a statistical difference. And that indicates that the 3 meals a day has a lower blood pressure. Now, the thing that you have to consider then is did the 1 meal a day increase the blood pressure, or did the 3 meals a day decrease the blood pressure? And that's where you need to look at the baseline. So if we look at the baseline, we look at systolic, it's 115.6. Let's make a note of diastolic, it's 68.1. So 115.6 to 116.1. Is that an increase? Yes, technically it is. But like the statistics would definitely strongly indicate that there's no difference. And it's all within the realm of error. Like there's an error rate there. So most likely the 1 meal a day had no effect on blood pressure. And what really happened is the 3 meals a day had a decrease in blood pressure. That's what happened. The diastolic blood pressure, there's really no change. Remember, it's like 68 at baseline, and it goes up to 69.8. So is there a difference? Yes, but is it a real world difference? A 1 millimeter per mercury difference? That's not anything to like care about. But there's a slight decrease in the diastolic, and that's why it's statistically significant. So again, for the 3 meals a day, there seems to be a slight advantage in that regard, but there's no harm specifically from 1 meal a day. Then we don't see really any changes otherwise except for body weight. We do see a slight decrease with the 1 meal a day, and we see that also reported at fat mass. And that's why I said that 100 calorie difference may have actually manifested over a 2-month period. So if you're continuously consuming 100 calories less, there might be a slight weight loss effect that occurs, and that's what seems to appear right here. So some things to consider overall. Nothing like overly shocking. I mean, neither one is necessarily negative. But here we're getting into a lot more of the specifics of looking at the blood values. Why this is important especially is because of what I mentioned earlier, right, with that caveat. So if you didn't hear my caveat about when they measure the blood, because it was different between the OMAD versus the 3 meals a day, then I would strongly recommend that you go back to that, because that could influence it definitely would influence how we would read this. So again, we're looking at the p-value here. We're looking for any sort of differences that are less than 0.05. And I'm not going to go over every single one of these. You can read them for yourself, but I wanted to go over some of the big ones. So we've got blood urea nitrogens, which is an indication of essentially the breakdown of amino acids into the bloodstream, the amount of nitrogen that's found in the bloodstream, or the consumption of proteins that are then found in the bloodstream. And you find that the 3 meals a day is slightly higher. Again, you also have to pay attention to effect size. You have to look at not just like, is it statistically significantly different, but if the difference is 3%, but it's statistically significant, do we care? The answer is probably not. And that's actually also true for something like these liver enzymes. So if you look at like alkaline phosphatase, or if you look at these transaminases, you see that they're elevated in the 1 meal a day. And then you'd be like, oh no, that's horrible because the liver is suffering all this stuff. And the differences are 3 international units per liter. Does that ultimately lead to an actual effect? Probably not. Like, it probably doesn't matter, even though it is statistically significant. I mean, again, you could disagree, but I would argue that probably doesn't make much of a difference. Now, if this persisted and continued to grow, okay, now you got problems. But we don't have that data. Triacylglycerols, this one is approaching statistical significance, and yet it's not statistically significant, and yet it's almost 100 milligrams per deciliter higher in the 3 meals a day condition. So triglycerides may slightly increase with the 3 meals a day. So something to consider. Cholesterol is a really interesting one, because this one, there were profound effects. If you'll allow me to go back here real quick. So we look at the baseline values for cholesterol, 182, LDL is 109. We go back to cholesterol. Cholesterol in the 1 meal a day increased to 216.5. So it increased pretty substantially. And it increased slightly in the 3 meals a day, but didn't change nearly as much. That's in total cholesterol. Now, LDL increased quite substantially as well, because it increased up to 136, while the 3 meals a day stayed roughly about the same, around that 113 mark. Now, HDL also increased. So HDL increased to 61.9, so a modest increase with the 1 meal a day. And all of them are statistically significant. But it's not so much that, it's just the actual effect size is actually something of note. Now, if this would maintain itself over time, well, I mean, they're doing this for 8 weeks, so it seems to be pretty maintained. Some people might argue, okay, well, cholesterol might increase because you need more of the lipoproteins to be released, which is what we're actually measuring here. So LDL is low density lipoprotein, HDL is high density lipoprotein. So the transport vehicles, we need more transport vehicles to move the nutrients across from the liver to the different tissues. And you could argue that, but ultimately, if you continuously have elevated cholesterol, especially at ApoB, then you start, that's a bit of a worry. So it's something to keep an eye on. It's something that we'll have to pay attention to. But again, I also should remark, this is 4 studies, and I'm going over one of them, and this one was designed for them not to lose much weight or to lose no weight, and they didn't lose much weight. So, we're talking about slightly artificial circumstances, because most likely when you're talking about OMAD, people are typically going to be losing a good amount of weight if they're doing OMAD. But if you're doing OMAD and maintaining your weight, maybe you want to get your cholesterol checked to see if some of these results are also true for you. And keep in mind, these are healthy individuals. So if you have really high cholesterol and you see cholesterol drop, you're not in the same population as this research, as this study. So, but I'm going to be covering a lot more studies on OMAD than just these and really pool together a lot more data. But as it stands, based on this study, cholesterol does increase and negatively increase for OMAD. And although there's a slight positive increase in the HDL, which is considered quote unquote the good cholesterol, however you want to translate that, ultimately my current reading, my current understanding on HDL and LDL and ApoB in general is that even though HDL is a positive marker, the more powerful marker is looking at ApoB, so looking at these LDL particles. And the LDL particles outweigh the HDL particles in terms of their benefit, or the cost benefit, risk benefit. Okay, so just another thing to add in here. And then something just peculiar, you get a doubling of cortisol levels in the 3 meals a day condition, which you do not. So you get half the amount in the 1 meal a day. Now, unfortunately, they don't actually have the baseline values for that. They didn't report that, but they do show that there's a statistical significant increase in cholesterol, or a difference, I should say, in cholesterol with 3 meals a day that you don't see with 1 meal a day. Okay, so really intriguing. I mean, pretty interesting exactly why we see an increase in cholesterol, or I'm sorry, in cortisol. I'm not sure. Could be stress related. I doubt that 15 people are suddenly feeling a lot more stressed on 3 meals a day, but maybe there's a stress response somehow. I don't know. Or maybe they have to undergo gluconeogenesis more often. I don't know. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, because you'd think it happened more with OMAD. But, there's although cortisol also increases nitrogen. So maybe this is related. So the high cortisol is leading to slightly elevated urea nitrogen, another possibility. So there's a lot of unanswered questions, but what we can definitely take away from this is that cholesterol increased more with the 1 meal a day. Oh, and I should mention one more thing, glucose, and this is important because as we get further into some of the other studies, the glucose levels here were roughly the same. So they were normal, healthy range, 85.9, 89.4 milligrams per deciliter. No differences between the two. These are fasting levels of glucose. But there's more to this story. There's definitely more to this story. And we're going to get to the other half of that story right now. Okay, so this other study also used public funding, and the reason why is because these are, they ended up employing the exact same format for their study that the previous study did. So study 18 and study 144 are extremely close in terms of they do the exact same thing. They also use a crossover design. They also use 15 men and women, all the same age, normal weight, healthy, stratify them into 1 meal a day, 3 meals a day, et cetera, And they do the measures, the blood value measures, like I described with the caveat in study 118. They do the exact same thing for this study. So just bear that in mind. Okay, but they do different blood tests on these individuals. They do a little bit more advanced blood tests than the others, because the other study was looking at fasting values. Now we're looking at what's known as an oral glucose tolerance test, an OGTT. So an OGTT is essentially where the participants consume 75 grams of glucose or sugar, so monosaccharide sugar, and then it ends up in the intestines. And obviously when it ends up in the intestines, it gets taken up by the epithelial cells of the intestines and ends up in the bloodstream. Then you can detect the change in blood values of glucose, so blood glucose, blood sugar. And the higher that it goes, the more that it's elevated, that indicates that there's a reduced blood sugar tolerance. And the previous study did not report insulin levels, but this study does report insulin levels. And what we find here is that there are no differences in insulin. So this is over time. So, right, they give the glucose, the consumable glucose, 75 grams here. That's at the 0 mark. So this is fasting levels. And then they go all the way to 120 minutes. And so 2 hours, they're kind of continuously measuring the blood sugar levels. So 20 minutes, 40 minutes, et cetera, et cetera. And they find that there are no differences across time in between the two groups in terms of insulin levels. So the insulin levels are no different. However, when looking at blood glucose levels, there are differences. And if we look at the baseline values, there are no differences at the beginning, which means that they're on equal footing. But as the blood sugar enters the bloodstream, it leads to greater levels in the 1 meal a day condition versus the 3 meals a day condition. So these individuals are less blood sugar tolerant compared to the 3 meals a day condition. So, and that's all that tells us if we just had this information. But considering we also have this information, this would indicate that these individuals are less insulin sensitive as well, because that means that with the same amount of insulin to clear away the blood sugar into the cells, you need more insulin to clear away the same amount of blood sugar. To lead to this same outcome as the 3 meals a day, you would need to up the insulin to get the same values for the 1 meal a day condition. So that is really important, because the previous study just looked at fasting levels and also did not report insulin levels, fasting insulin levels. This one is looking at both and specifically taxing the body to see in a controlled environment what happens in their ability to process glucose. And remember, their nutrition is the exact same. It's just the timing of when they consume that nutrition. So this is really intriguing and something that we need more data on to really corroborate. Okay, so then we're looking at all these values. So here we've got our fasting levels. So fasting levels of all these. And then we've got our HOMA-IR, which is our insulin resistance measure. And then we've got a oral glucose insulin sensitivity index. And then we've got an insulin sensitivity index. There's a number of different indices that they've got here. I'm not going to go over all of them that relate to insulin resistance, blood sugar tolerance, and that's really what they were focused on. And then they have a series of different hormones that they were also interested in. So we're going to go over those as well. All right, so for the glucose values here, we have glucose is elevated in the 1 meal a day condition. So the fasting levels, and I think I misspoke earlier that they measured I will add an amendment if this next statement turns out not to be true. I believe they actually ended up measuring the glucose levels after 12 hours of fasting, even in the OMAD condition. So remember the disadvantage of that, and where that could be slightly problematic. But ultimately, which I mentioned when discussing the previous study, so go back to that section, the caveat. I'll have a note so you can just easily skip to it. The blood sugar levels were higher in the OMAD condition compared to the 3 meals a day condition. And not by, it's not by just statistical significance, it's 10 milligrams per deciliter. So a pretty substantial amount. And remember, their diet is the exact same. It's just the timing of the diet. Insulin levels were the same. So no differences in insulin levels, which the other study did not indicate. Glucagon levels were not different, the exact same. Now, according to this measure, so HOMA-IR, which is a less sensitive measure of insulin resistance, but it is a measure of insulin resistance, there were no differences. However, when you're looking at the oral glucose insulin sensitivity index, which is this, taking the data from this and then coming up with an insulin sensitivity index, the higher it is, the better. We see that there is a decrease, so 403 versus 458, and it is statistically significant. So here we are getting an indication that there's reduced insulin sensitivity, as I predicted earlier when I talked about looking at that data. MCR is another measure. We're just, again, looking at insulin sensitivity, and we're seeing no differences. So you're getting some like conflicting data, and I really think that that's because you need a lot of granularity. You need more, first off, you need more participants. And secondly, it depends on the test that you're using to measure it, because this test is more indicative of under a stress situation. So if you were to just give straight carbohydrates, what happens to, how does the body react? And we find that and it's not like huge difference. It's not like this one is at 100 and this one is at 1,000 or something like that. We're talking about a 50-point difference between these two. So is it possible it's really mild? Yeah, it's perfectly possible that none of these other tests, ISI, MCR, are getting these results, like that they're insulin insensitive or insulin resistant, because this test is a very particular condition, and the effect size isn't that huge. So it's possible that there's that this test is just more sensitive. That's essentially what I'm getting at. Beta cell function, these are the cells that produce the insulin and secrete it into the bloodstream. We see that the first phase, so that's a measure of the amount of insulin that's released from the 2-minute mark after consuming of glucose to 15-minute mark, so that very first phase of insulin release. And we see that there's a much dampened response in the 1 meal a day condition. So their insulin release is much lower in the first 15 minutes compared to the 3 meals a day. And then the beta cell function in the second phase, which is ongoing from after the first 15 minutes for the next 2 to 3 hours, was the same. So there are no differences. And then all these other measures, all the hormonal measures, so adiponectin, as I mentioned, glucagon, resistin. Adiponectin, for example, is heavily implicated in insulin sensitivity. So the higher adiponectin levels, you typically have better insulin sensitivity. We do not see that effect. We don't see any changes whatsoever. They're exactly identical, even down to their standard deviation. So no differences whatsoever. So interesting, right? And I think all of this indicates to me that really the insulin sensitivity effect is really mild. We're not talking about massive detriment to our insulin sensitivity by consuming 1 meal a day. And then looking at leptin levels, resistin, ghrelin, all those are exactly identical. So there are no differences in those either. And then finally, BDNF. BDNF is most known, although it has other functions as well. It's called brain-derived neurotrophic factor. It's most well known for its effects in brain development and brain growth and brain plasticity. And there are no differences between those two either. Okay, moving on to study 145. So here we're looking at mixed funding. If you're interested in the actual where the funding came from and whatnot, I'll add it to the notes. So this is not just public funding. It could be some private funding or nonprofit funding that may be also included in this. So I usually break it up as public funding, industry funding, or nonprofit funding, just to distinguish them. And then if you want, in the notes, I'll indicate exactly where, like what companies or, what agency supplied the funding. So this is mixed funding. Okay, so this one is certainly different because it's 1 meal a day versus 3 meals a day. And it's 13, so slightly smaller sample size. So 13 men and women that were 30 years of age, so slightly younger as well. And it was roughly equal, those 6 6 women, 5 men, and they were normal weight and they were otherwise healthy. Another difference here, another difference here is that they only were on each diet for 11 days. So 11 days on one meal a day. Then they had a 2-week washout. So again, crossover. So there's a crossover design. So 11 days, then 2 weeks back on their normal diet, just away from the lab, no input from the researchers, back to eating Doritos, whatever they want to eat, or maybe they're eating a really healthy diet, who knows? And then 11 days back. When they come back, they're on the same diet, but 3 meals a day. So it was randomized, double-blind. Again, I explained that in study 18, what those mean. And that's it. Really, I mean, it's pretty similar. It's just really the sample size, the age, and the length of time that these individuals are on each diet. All right. So again, this was designed to be weight maintenance. So the calories are supposed to be the same. But again, it's so difficult to consume, to not be used to it, and to then for 11 days just consume all your nutrients in one go. And I think that the researchers often underestimate that. I think that for something like that, you really need to be a lot more careful. But it turns out that, and I think that for this one, they did not do a 20-hour fast. It was just like overnight, they did the measurements for like triglycerides, cholesterol, and whatnot. So for this one, they're doing OMAD and 3 meals a day. And then 12 hours later in the morning, they're doing the fasted blood measurements, which I mentioned some of the drawbacks of that in the study 18. Okay, so looking at total body weight, we see that there is a statistical significant difference. So if you see a asterisk here, that means that there is a statistically significant difference between these two conditions. Unfortunately, again, these researchers did not present the actual baseline, but this is minus 0.5 from baseline. So they're showing us the delta. So they're not showing us it's not like these people weigh 1.4 kilograms. This is the actual delta. This is the actual difference between the baseline versus the result at the end of the 11 days. So the 3 meals a day, they did lose a little bit of weight, but the 1 meal a day lost more weight. And that's why there's a statistical significance between these, difference between these two. The fat mass, again, same thing. Of course, it's reflected, so most likely these people were consuming less. Now, an additional thing that I wanted to throw in here that I didn't actually mention in the introduction was looking at the resting energy expenditure. So we're looking at metabolism here. And there are no differences between the two groups in this condition. There are no changes in, well, at least I suppose I can't say that there are no changes because we don't actually know what the baseline values were. But as it's reported here, there are no differences between the two after almost 2 weeks, so 11 days. RQ is respiratory quotient. We're talking about like, are they using more fat or are they using more glucose? This is right in the middle, so they're doing a nice mixture of two. There are no differences between those two either. Now, in terms of, we're looking at triglycerides, cholesterol, some of the same measures that we looked at earlier. And here we again see that the cholesterol levels were not different in this situation, unlike the previous study. HDL was the same, unlike the previous study, but like the previous study, there was an increase in LDL, again, in the 1 meal a day. Now, is the effect size huge? No, it's relatively small, but it is pronounced. So there is a statistical significant difference. So LDL does increase with 1 meal a day. Now, AST and ALT, again, measures of the liver. And again, these are slightly elevated. Again, not statistically significant, but again, we're talking about small sample size here. So it may be underpowered. And so that there's no effect. But, if we take this data plus the other data together, I would bet that there's a slight increase. But again, does that really matter? Probably not, because these values are such small differences between the two. So I wouldn't worry about it too much until we have even more data than the two studies that covered it. Okay, then looking at glucose levels. So this is a more granular look at glucose levels. So this is they measured on each one of the days through a continuous glucose monitor. They looked at the overall amount of glucose, the millimole amount that was found. So the concentration that was found in the bloodstream over the entire day, the average. And they found that there are no differences across the board. So no day were the participants different from one another. So in total glucose, there's no difference if you consume 1 meal a day or 3 meals a day. That may be of importance to you, especially, well, I suppose we can't extend this to diabetics because they have different glucose regulation. But if you're interested in this as a healthy individual, then a person without diabetes, a person without any sort of metabolic syndrome, then here you go. There are no differences. However, the overall glucose levels throughout a single day, so this is per day, the average, so putting all of this together into one number, that's what these bars are. However, looking at the glucose levels over the entire day, so over a 24-hour period, so we've got 0 here, let's say, and then 24 here, we see that blood sugar levels decrease at the beginning for both. So black is 3 meals a day and the light gray is the 1 meal a day. We see that they both decline. Why is that? Probably because they're asleep. During this period, they're asleep. And then the 3 meals a day eats breakfast and eats lunch. And therefore, their blood sugar levels increase throughout the day. So for the next 6 hours or whatever it might be, their blood sugar levels increase and are statistically significantly elevated compared to the OMAD group. Because again, the OMAD group is continuing not to consume anything. They're fasting, so their blood sugar levels are really low. And then they consume that one gigantic meal, and suddenly their blood sugar levels then start to increase quite substantially. But overall, the average amount, we see that there's no differences between the two if the calories and if the nutrients are equivalent between the two groups. Another one is to look at a test over, so this is known as a mixed meal test. So they're using, it's the same as the OGTT, so the oral glucose tolerance test that I mentioned earlier. However, it is also including fats and proteins. This is not very common. It's not as common as an oral glucose tolerance test, but I'll report it anyway. So we've got the glucose levels here. Again, this is over in this case, we're talking about a 3-hour period as opposed to a 2-hour period. And we see that there are no statistical differences in blood sugar levels after a mixed meal test, an MMT. I sound so smart when I just contracted as an MMT, the MMT or the OGTT, Anyway, so after the MMT, the insulin levels did increase after consuming. Obviously, it does include carbohydrates, but it also includes fats and proteins, and blood sugar levels increased similarly, or insulin levels increased similarly, although blood sugar levels did increase substantially as well. But insulin levels increased equivalently in both conditions, so no differences. TBA is another measure that they wanted to look at as well. There's no differences in this, as well as FGF19. FGF19 is just a secretory hormone from the gut and essentially just indicates if there are going to be any changes in hormonal variation from the consumption of 1 meal a day versus 3 meals a day, and specifically towards gut hormones. And you can see this is almost identical. I mean, even with any level of variation, there's no difference whatsoever. So none of these values change, but I thought I'd report them anyway. Hey, if you're thinking that you maybe want to ask me questions and things of that nature, unfortunately, I get a lot of comments, public comments and whatnot. So if you're interested in actually being able to reach me and be able to get answers from me and whatnot, you should really consider joining my Insiders program, where you'll get access to this full study analysis, including, well, obviously ad-free, but also including the portions that are cut out of the public version. And it gets a lot more granular, so I get into more application and things of that nature, as well as if you have additional questions and you actually want to get answers from me, you can message me there and I respond as quickly as I can. So that's one thing. to consider, but also you get access to seminars, which are groupings of many, many different studies to come to applicable conclusions that you can actually apply to your life. I also have research reviews on a whole host of different topics, which are really easy reads. They're like maybe 2-3 pages of putting together research with, again, applicable conclusions at the end, so what you can actually apply to your life. And I have these office hours where are these live sessions where people put in questions. So if you have a particular question you want answered, you can ask me, and then I'll add it to the docket for the live session. And then I'll put together a little presentation to cover your topic. And then we can discuss it as a group. So if you're interested in any of that or all of that, then certainly consider joining the Physionic Insiders. It helps Physionic grow, and it also allows me to better serve you. So with that, let's get back to the rest of this presentation. All right, so now I added this study because technically it's not OMAD. It's not like they specifically say it's OMAD, but it's 4 hours of eating time and 6 hours of eating time. We're going to be more focused on the 4 hours compared to the usual control group, the 3 meals a day that I mentioned earlier. However, what was unique about this is that they did not tell participants that they had to maintain their weight or try to maintain their weight, because we saw how well that worked in the previous studies. So this is unique in that, one, the people are overweight, and secondly, they're just told, hey, just eat this way, like, eat within this time, but you don't have to like restrict your calories specifically or try to count calories to make sure that you're consuming enough, or that you have to just generally try to maintain your weight. If they lose weight, then they lose weight, great. And this is really telling to the unintended issue or unintended weight loss that I was alluding to at the very beginning. Now, this study is also publicly funded, just so usually it's government agency funding, so taxpayer funding. So some other differences here as well is that we've got a larger sample size. So it's 58 women, which made up the majority of the group, and some men. So a very small minority are men. 45 years of age, they were overweight, although healthy, with a slightly elevated blood pressure. And this is slightly different as well in that it's parallel design, meaning that the participants aren't hopping from the 4-hour window, or what we're going to call the OMAD, to the control group, and then going to the 6-hour after washout periods. There's no washout periods. It's just like you're allocated to one group or another group, and you just stick to it for 10 weeks in this situation. And then the researchers measure, and then they compare within the groups as well as between the groups. So they had some individuals in the 4-hour group, which again, I'm going to designate as the OMAD group. And typically they did consume their meals as just one meal. And then the 6-hour group, so slightly extended period of time, they've got 18 hours of fasting and 6 hours of consumption. Obviously, the 4-hour group is 20 hours of fasting and 4 hours of consumption. But again, it was usually one meal. And the control group, which is just consuming whenever they wanted to, just like they traditionally would, but they have to stick to relatively the same nutrition as these other groups as well. This was randomized. Again, all good to see, double blind. I've mentioned that earlier in the video. And it was 10 weeks long, so a pretty lengthy amount of time. So longest study so far, so about two and a half months. All right, so to discuss this, we see that they're looking at the overall weight loss differences, and this is an intriguing way to actually identify this or show this. So for the weight loss, they've got the control group. You see the control group doesn't lose any weight whatsoever. So this is weeks 1 through 8. And the reason why they don't mention 10 weeks is because they had a 2-week period where they slowly introduced them to the diets. And then it was like really 8 weeks where they were like sticking to their particular like 4-hour window, 6-hour window, etc. And what we see is that the control group did not lose weight. Okay, not exactly shocking. I mean, if they're going to continue to consume what they normally consume with, very minor adjustments, then they're not going to lose any weight. However, both groups, both of the intermittent fasting groups, if that was 6-hour or 4-hour, they both lost weight, and they both lost equivalent amounts of weight. So about 3.2% of their body weight they lost, which is pretty substantial over an 8-week period. Now, additionally, what the researchers decided to do is also indicate the extra hours of fasting that they had over baseline. So this is the fasting, the amount of time that they were fasting over the normal amount of baseline, over the control. So this is each one of the participants. So each one of these bars is one participant that's involved in the 4-hour group. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. So 13 individuals in the 4-hour group. And so they're all broken up. And so that's all the amount of actual fasting time. And this down here is the actual weight loss that each person did. So then you can compare, if they fasted more, did they lose more weight? And the answer is that there's a lot of variability, because the answer is no. Here we've got this person that fasted, let's say 6 hours extra on top of, sleeping and all that stuff. So it's not 6 hours total, it's 6 hours extra. And they lost the most amount of weight. Now, is that maybe because they weighed a little bit more, or they were able to restrict their food intake a little bit more? It's, those kinds of considerations are all unknowns. We don't know that information, but it does indicate that fasting longer does not necessarily mean that you will lose more weight. That's essentially what this is getting at. And the same exact is true for the 6-hour group. We've got these individuals. So this individual really didn't stick to their fasting regimen. I don't know if it was a man or woman in this situation. Really didn't stick to, was essentially doing the bare minimum, and ended up losing a little bit of weight. So losing about 4% weight loss. However, this person did fast, let's say about 5 hours extra, and didn't lose really any weight, maintained their weight. So this person, it didn't benefit them whatsoever. But for most of these individuals, there was a benefit from the fasting. So again, all this illustrates is that fasting alone does not lead to weight loss. It just does, in fasting more does not necessarily lead to weight loss. Now, in terms of adherence, so the number of days per week that people were adhering to this diet, because it's not like they were locked away. They led their normal lives, and then the researchers had a number of different ways of probing how adherent people were to sticking to their diet. And they found that most people, so the average, if that was the 6 hours or 4 hours, obviously they did measure the control, because it's impossible to say, hey, did you eat your normal food like you always do? Kind of impossible to, the answer is always yes, of course, because I'm alive and I'm eating. But with the 4-hour and 6-hour period, there's a specific restriction there. So they measure that, and they indicate that roughly it's about, let's say, between 6 and 7 days a week, they were able to continuously stick to their routine, to this routine that they were supposed to be on for over the 8 weeks. So at the 8-week mark, the average was about 6.5 days a week. So the reason why we get like a discrepancy there is because we're looking at an average. We're not looking at a single person. So obviously for a single person, they'd be able to say, yeah, I ate that way 6 days out of the week. But one day I kind of fell off. I ate, 5 hours. I ate for 5 hours instead of 4 hours, something like that. So we're looking at averages. And overall, this looks pretty good. Everybody was at least around 6 days they stuck to this nutrition. And usually it was closer to the 6.5, 7 day mark. So pretty good adherence. Maybe not perfect, but pretty good. Okay, so now looking at fat mass, lean mass, visceral fat. So that's pretty important too. Each one of these little gray dots is a particular person, is an individual. And then the black dot is the average. So if you put all the individuals together and then you were to quantify it into a single number, that number is the black dot. And when we're looking at fat mass, we see that the control was higher, obviously, well, if I can go back here real quick, obviously these individuals lost weight. So where did that weight come from? That's really the question that we're asking. And we can see that fat mass was higher, loss of fat mass was higher in the 4-hour condition compared to the control. There were no differences between the 6-hour and between the 6-hour condition. Yeah, that's right. 6-hour condition and the 4-hour condition. No differences. So it doesn't really matter if you fast for 2 hours longer, or if you decide to cut your fast short. The point is that they both lead to equivalent amounts. Now, it's possible you could maybe see a trend there. We don't know statistics on this, so there may be a trend there towards the 4-hour being more advantageous. And if they'd had more participants, maybe double the number of participants, they would have had enough power to tease out differences between these two conditions. I don't know. But as it stands, there's no difference. But what we do know is that the fasting conditions, the OMAD condition specifically, did lead to loss of body fat. Now, lean mass, there were significant differences compared to the 6-hour condition. Your guess is as good as mine as to why that might be, because the lean mass in the OMAD condition, there were no differences compared to the control. However, both of them were different against the 6-hour condition. Who knows why that happened? Visceral fat, so specifically trying to determine between subcutaneous fat, so the fat that's under your skin, versus the fat that's around your organs, there were no statistical differences in any of the conditions. It's possible that there's a trend towards a difference, but again, they would have to do the study longer, or they'd have to do the study with more participants to be able to actually tease out that difference. So as it stands, there's no difference in visceral fat loss. Fasting glucose levels, something of note, right? Something that we've gone over and over again. But this, in this instance, there's a drop, or there's essentially no difference. I should say there's no difference in fasting blood sugar levels. Okay, so that's different from some of the other studies. Some of the other studies indicated that there might be a slight increase, but that may be due to the timing of when they measured. That may be due to the fact that this group actually lost more weight and actually lost more body fat. The other groups, they may have lost a little bit of weight, but they didn't lose nearly as much as these individuals. It may also be because these individuals are overweight and the other individuals were not. Fasting insulin levels were slightly, I would say that they're more increased in the control group and stayed relatively, stayed at the standard level in both of the fasting levels, the OMAD 4-hour versus the 6-hour. And insulin resistance remained about equal, remained lower in the fasting conditions versus the control condition. The control condition had a slight bump up in their insulin resistance compared to the other two conditions, but there are no differences between those two. All right, so the next things I'm going to be covering are OMAD on inflammation, so looking at some inflammatory markers, as well as OMAD on oxidative stress. But as it stands right now in the public version of this video, if you're interested in continuing on, then you can join my Insiders program and get access to the unabridged, the full version of this video. But for those that are going to be stopping here, with the midpoint conclusion, here are the conclusions that I'm making. You don't have to agree with me. You certainly don't have to agree with me. And I would say that we do need more data to really be conclusive about this. But there's one thing I definitely can say. OMAD encourages unintended weight loss, because a lot of these studies, the researchers are like, hey, don't try to lose weight. Don't like diet or anything. Don't try to stick to a number of calories or anything like that. But OMAD almost always led to weight loss. So OMAD is a fantastic way to go if you want to just lose weight. I think point blank, end of story, I think that's absolutely true. But one of the problems is that especially for cholesterol, we saw across multiple studies that for people that tried to maintain their weight with OMAD, which is, I realize that's a rarity. Not very many people are going to be using OMAD to maintain their weight. But for those individuals, it seems to slightly increase their cholesterol, their total cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, and HDL cholesterol. And so that may be something to consider. Another thing is that it doesn't lead to a decrease in blood pressure like the 3 meals a day. So the same diet, but 3 meals a day led to a slight decrease in systolic blood pressure based off of one study. And we need more information to really be able to tease out if that's an effect that stands for across multiple studies. But the cholesterol we saw across 2 studies. One study showed no effect on cholesterol, like where we didn't see much of an effect. And that may be just because of the timing of when they measure, or it may be because of the weight of the individuals when they first started out, or the fact that they lost more weight, or whatever it might be. Additionally, blood sugar clearance may be reduced. That was based off the oral glucose tolerance test that I mentioned, but data is mixed. So the reason for that, the reason why I mentioned that is because the fasting levels were didn't seem to have much of an effect. So like fasting levels were increased for some studies and were didn't show an increase in other studies. And I think a lot of that may be driven by the fact of the starting point, where you're starting. If you're overweight and you lose weight, that almost always tends to drop blood sugar levels. And it also may matter about the timing of when these blood tests are being taken. As I mentioned, I've mentioned it 4 times now. Go back to the caveat that I mentioned in study 18 if you want to know more information on that. So the data is mixed. And this is so important. Other than the unintended weight loss, I definitely think the weight loss is a pretty strong, like there's good evidence for that. Even with just 4 studies, there's good evidence for that. But more data is needed to make the firm conclusions on any one of these measures: blood pressure, cholesterol, blood sugar. I think we need more data to really be able to tease out those differences. So that said, that's what I've got for you. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Hopefully you learned something. I realize that I can't give you hard facts exactly because, I'm trying to be cautious. I'm trying to be intellectually honest by saying like, yeah, okay, like one study indicates one thing, another study indicates something else. So we need more data. That's what it ultimately comes down to. And I hope that once more data comes out, I'll be able to cover that and we'll be able to get to some more conclusions in the future. But for sure, OMAD for weight loss, it seems like a great thing. And we'll see about the cholesterol effects and whatnot. But until then, thanks for sticking out to this point, and I'll hope to speak with you in the near future. Bye.